Hey, Blazor fans. The few of you that are out there, at least one. um, Jeff Fritz has a stream going right now, so it's probably pulling away some of our viewers. We'll wait a couple seconds to get started, just in case some people actually want to join. It's these type of things happen when you come back from a new year. It's kind of expected, so we'll kind of pause the show here for just a second, see if anybody else is out there. And I am not properly connected to even the chat room, so give me a sec just to get things up and running. I can't see if you guys are typing anything out there. Hey, John Galloway's out there. Thanks, man. Happy New Year to you too. Thanks for coming on the chat room with everybody. It's weird. Chat room is not loading up properly for me, so I'm getting messages. I'm not getting viewer numbers. I may need to reboot the stream or something. Let's see. All right, so looks like we've got some technical difficulties with Twitch. Maybe because I'm hosting C# Fritz and his show hasn't ended. I literally can't tell if anybody's out there that can actually hear me or not. So let me pull up my Twitch dashboard and see what's going on. Looks like I am live. Okay. All right, there we go. Cool. Welcome to the show, folks. I just saw a couple people actually popped in finally. I think we were having some technical issues a minute ago. I couldn't get chat going, so I'm not sure if the stream got broadcasted out. And a brand new follower as well. Let's see here. Thank you, Ahmad, for following the show. We're about to get started. I'm trying to give some folks a few minutes to kind of join the stream, and we'll get things going. Still working through a little bit of technical stuff here, just real quick, and we'll start doing some news and coding. Just coming back from a long break, so some of my tooling, either I got updates to various pieces of the streaming software that aren't playing well with my setup, or something else is going on. So let me just chime in with the Gitter audience as well, see if anybody else wants to join in, and then we'll get going. Feel free to ask questions if you guys have questions anytime in the chat room. That's what I'm here for. And today we'll talk about some community projects. We'll talk about validation in Blazor, and if we have time, we'll try to hack on one of the items from the news today. So let's just shout out one more invite to folks and see if we can get a few more in here. Gitter channel is a great spot to interact with people that are interested in Blazor. That's where I'm throwing this invite out. See if anybody's in there wants to come join us in the chat room. I know Jeff Fritz is still streaming. Maybe some of the folks will jump over after he's done. I know he's been going for quite a while. He's got a great show as well. So hopefully we'll see some of those people come over. Visual Studio is also telling me to update. I'm not going to do that right now, that's for sure. A few more joining us. Welcome to Blazor State Has Changed. We're about ready to get started here. Let's pull up the window where we do all our work. I've got Visual Studio open. I don't want that yet. I want to go through some news items first. First item is something that was sent to me on Twitter. This is by Robert Sundstrom, and Robert's built a quick and easy CMS using Blazor. So that's a pretty interesting piece of code to check out. He's got the ability to grab various markdown files and use those as a simple content management system. And it's all done using Blazor, and it's using the WebAssembly version of Blazor. So it's it looks like it's an early release of this project. He's got some plans to make it a little more robust, but I'll put this in my show notes if you want to check out his source code and see how he's built it. He actually is running his personal blog, which is just about 1 or 2 simple pages right now, but this is running in Blazor. So you saw the speed of it's actually pretty nice. It came up pretty quickly there in the browser. So it looks like this is a pretty feasible option for running a simple content management system. So thanks, Robert, for sending that over on Twitter, and hopefully people will check that out. And again, I'll put that in the show notes so everybody can find that. I'll drop a link here in the chat room as well if anybody wants to bookmark that to check out later. The other thing I wanted to touch on was something else I saw tweeted out. This one came from Ryan Nowak. Ryan is on the team building Blazor, and he had a pretty big pull request that went through the ASP.NET Core project this week, and that was related to Blazor and Razor components. And the gist of it is there is a brand new compiler for Razor components and Blazor. And this seems to have dropped something like 600 lines of code. It's really slimmed down, a lot faster. But in his tweets, there was some interesting information I wanted to point out. There was a question that asked, and this was by Scott Sauber. Scott has been working quite a bit on Blazor on the community side. He's got a Visual Studio Code plugin that has code generation features and support for Blazor. So Scott asks, if a Razor component has no functions in it, it's just HTML basically, are WebSockets still used when you're using Razor components, or is it treated more like a tag helper or view component? Ryan replied that they're not sure how they're going to handle this stuff yet, but there are plans in the works for using this component model in other areas in ASP.NET Core. Now, I might be reading a little bit more into this, but I've heard rumors that the component model is going to find its way into things like ASP.NET MVC ASP.NET Core, the MVC model as well. So that may be what he's alluding to there. I might be reading too much into it, but it looks like we're going to see a lot more of the Blazor style of creating components used throughout the .NET framework. JenSQ says Blazor templated components. Is that what the current terminology is for this idea? Because it looks like even if you're not using Blazor, you might be able to use this component model. And I think this might be what he's talking about. I'll have to clear this up. I've got some time with these folks at NDC London, and maybe they'll be able to shed some more light on it. I don't know what's under NDA, what's not. So I'll have to see what's going on there, but it looks like we'll see a lot more of this simple ability to build components out using the markup that we use in Blazor. So we'll see. Yeah, and Jeremy Lickness actually, his MVVM post is based on this tweet. I just saw that Jeremy actually posted that blog post. Let's actually, let me see if I can remember his, web address here. He said he just posted this, so yeah, MVVM support in Blazor. This was not on my agenda to talk about today, but he just released this. And since Janescu mentioned it here in the chat room, I'll go ahead and post this link as well. I haven't got a chance to read this yet. Literally, he just posted this, so I'll have to read through this myself and see what he's got going on in here. But it looks, Jeremy's an excellent writer. He's been doing this for a long time. He's well known in the Silverlight community, so I'm really interested. I was actually just talking to him in direct message before the show. I was asking him when this blog post is coming out because I was excited to read it. So I'm going to be reading that immediately after the show today, and hopefully I'll get some new info out of this. I'm not sure. Let's see. MVVM support in Blazor. I'm not sure this is the correct link. I'll have to follow up with them, and I'll put it in the show notes. Because, again, this is all just happening very quickly this afternoon. Trying to stay on top of things as they're kind of tweeted out. People are coming back from their long breaks on vacation and whatnot, and they're starting to work on ideas they had over the break. So there's a lot of new stuff coming out this week. So we'll follow up on that later in the show, or later, next week on the show. But it looks like we've got a lot of Blazor related things happening in the ecosystem, which is very nice to hear. Last item on my news agenda. Blazor toast notifications using only C#. So this means there's no JavaScript in here. If I scroll down here, there's a nice animation that shows you what the results of this look like. So we've got, there we go, toast notifications here using 100% C# code. And you get this nice pop-up effect. There's some nice animations fading in, and we're able to do all of this with only C#. I've read through the article quite a bit. It's really well laid out. And this is an article by Chris Santi. And it's something that I'd like to actually build on the show later today if we have enough viewers and time to do it. I want to talk about validation first. But if we have time left over, we may go through and actually just build this out because it's really neat. He's got a way that he's using services in here to act upon this toast notification at an application level, which I thought was interesting. It's also very interactive. You have the toast notification hiding and showing different settings for it. It's a pretty well-rounded example of how to build a UI component. So we'll try to get into that if everybody's interested and we have enough time to cover that at the end. So one of the things I want to talk about today, go ahead and close this down for now. We'll get back into that in a bit, is validation. I've seen quite a bit of validation examples out there. There's even supposed to be one by Steve Sanderson that I haven't been able to look at yet, but quite a few of the examples I've seen are using either JavaScript, which is kind of not the point of what we're trying to do with Blazor. So I don't want to put a bunch of JavaScript validation code into my projects. And then I've seen another take on this with data annotations. And I'm not a huge fan of data annotations. I know there's a bunch of people out there that really like it and want to see it put in Blazor, which I don't have a problem with. I hope that is an option. But one of the things I was tinkering with the other day was Fluent Validation. This is something that's not included with Blazor. There's actually no validation in Blazor yet, which is what has me out searching for some type of solution. And myself, I look for things that are already in the ecosystem before I go out and try to build something from scratch. And I decided to take a look at Fluent Validation because it's based on .NET Standard, and it seems like it might have worked out of the box. So took a quick look at it, and it seems like that is an option for us. So let's go ahead and open up a new project and add some validation to it. And we'll use that to possibly integrate that with another project later, one that I've been working on with a tab set that we've seen on the show previously. So I'm going to go to File, New Project. I'm going to create a brand new project from scratch so we can see how this can be added to a Blazor app, and it's actually pretty quick. So let's call this StateHasChanged validation. And when I tinkered with this the other day, I used Razor components. Everything worked pretty well with Razor components. Let's go ahead and do a full stack ASP.NET Core hosted app this time, and we can see how well it works with WebAssembly. If it doesn't work with WebAssembly, then this is all news to me. I haven't tried this out yet. So we will fail together, which is kind of a theme of the show. I try not to prepare too much ahead of time. This is on purpose. I think there's a lot to be learned with running into issues and trying to solve those problems as a group with you guys in chat. So thanks again for joining me today while this boots up. Appreciate you guys viewing. Welcome back from the new year. And we're going to try to do this every week once again this year. I will have some small breaks coming up this month. The 18th, I have a Telerik webinar instead of the show that day. I'll actually be out of town. And then the following week, I will be at NDC London. So we'll have to work a schedule around those items, but I will try to get a show up every week. All right, so we've got a new Blazor application up. This is a full stack Blazor app. So it's using WebAssembly. It's using an ASP.NET Core server to serve the application, but there's no server-side rendering and things like that. It's the basic starter or hello world type project. We can go ahead and do a little quick preview here to make sure everything's working properly. We'll get that up and running. Make sure we don't have any compile errors or anything like that. Remember, I did have a bunch of updates go through over the holidays I haven't quite all checked out yet. So let's see how this is working out. Got our app loading up. And good. So app works out of the box. We've got our counter and fetch data components. Let's hack away on the counter component. What I want to do is add a count by field to this and then add validation to it to only allow certain numbers to be used to count by. So right now we are counting by 1. Let's look at the code for this counter. We go into pages and counter. If you're new to Blazor, this is the folder that you'll find all of the components for this default application. So our counter component lives under pages, and this is the code behind, or the code for our counter component. And right now it's very simple. We just have a paragraph that shows the current count. We have a button that is bound to a a method called increment count, and we're just incrementing by 1 there using that increment operator. So that's our counter right now. What I want to do next is add a field here. I'm just going to add a quick break in this, and we'll do an input here. Oh, not index, but input. And I'm going to name this because I'm going to use a label for it. So we'll call this count by. And this is going to be, I'm going to set it to text for now. So type equals text. And we'll go ahead and close that off. And then we'll do a label for count by. And then we're going to wire this count by box up to when we click the button to this increment count method. So when we increment this count, let's try to refresh this guy here. We should have our box and our label on the screen now. There we go. Horizontal rule is missing. It's kind of odd. Oops, I did a break. I meant HR, not BR. Just kind of give this a little bit of a layout. We're not going to make it too fancy. But what we're going to do is whatever number is in here, we're going to count by that number when we click the button. Real simple setup, but we're just going to kind of try to validate the value that is in here. And I've purposely set it to text. There is a little bit of built-in HTML validation that you can do by setting the type on the input box to number instead of text. But we're going to keep this a little bit more open just for now so we can test out those validations. So we need to bind this to actually do something next. So what we need to do is count by, and we want to count by the value that is in this text box. So we need to actually set up a placeholder for it. So we'll set up a backing field. We'll call it count by. We'll start it out at 1 just by default. And now we should be able to bind that. And we can say, we don't even need those quotes. We can say count by. And then when we increment count, we want to do plus equal, or plus equals count by. There we go. So now we should be bound to this text box here. So we can do some counting. Oh, sorry, I missed a question in the chat room. My chat widget still hasn't caught up with this this issue. So I'm only seeing, I've got 2 ways to monitor chat. So I apologize if I'm not catching your questions. One of my monitors is not working right. So does the new .NET Core stuff for Blazor also make the page size smaller, or is it about as big as it was with Mono WASM for Mono? I believe I know what you're asking about. This is a question regarding Ryan Nowak's post. Let me see. I can't remember off the top of my head if can't remember off the top of my head if Ryan had specified what exactly the improvements were and where they would take place. I know the compile times are supposed to be faster and whatnot, but I don't recall whether it made the file sizes smaller. Oh, sorry, wrong post. Sorry I didn't catch this while I was actually talking about it in the news segment, but these Twitch modules I have, some of them updated, and I can't really get my chat where I want it to be, so I'm missing some things here. Let's see. So here's the actual GitHub post that he made. So they've made it much more efficient. I don't see anything in here about it making the file sizes smaller. I think that would be in the linker. And I don't think this improves the linker any. I would say this has more to do with performance and portability than runtime performance. This is more of a design time compiler, as far as I know. So I don't think so. Fubarius, I don't think that has any effect on the output file size. I think it has more to do with the tooling's file size and performance. Something I can try to ask in person when I get some time with these folks. Again, though, I think the linker is what's driving all of those runtime file reductions, and I know that's something that's being worked on. I just don't know in what capacity it's at right now. So let's see, we were binding the application to the count box, or count by box. So right now we're counting by 1. We should be able to put 5 in here, and there we go. That's working. That's pretty easy. But what we don't want to do is somebody put like A in here, because we can't really count by A. It seems like it's just keeping the last value that we put in. 0 wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. Maybe we don't want somebody to count by like -5. It does work, but let's pretend that we want to validate against that, or maybe we want to have a range of numbers that's available. So looking at options for validation, there's not really a whole lot built in, but there is an option in the .NET ecosystem for doing different types of validation. One of those things is called Fluent Validation. So if we go into dependencies here and manage NuGet packages, let's do quick browse, and we'll say Fluent Validation. Let's put this guy in our project. Go ahead and install that. There's also various add-ons for this. You can see Fluent Validation. There's unit test extensions, so you can do robust testing of your validations. There are plugins for Xamarin. There's plugins for ASP.NET MVC. And most of the web additions to Fluent Validations emit JavaScript, so you can do client-side validation with Fluent Validation and use the same models on your front end. Since we're not dealing with JavaScript, we don't need that. So we've added Fluent Validation to our project. Let's go ahead and pull up the web address real quick, just so we could see a quick idea of how to implement one of these validators. And it's actually a really nice API. I really like this. I haven't used it myself in production. I've seen other code bases where it's been used. It looks like it's really easy to understand. If you had a new person join your team or something like that, they would be able to get this really quickly. And it's kind of an alternative to data annotations. It's a more programmatic approach than adding metadata to your project, which I like. Personal preference, of course. Like, there's no right or wrong way to do these, but you basically create a class that inherits from this abstract validator, and you give it a type of what you want to validate. So this is a generic type. It can be pretty much anything that you want to add in there. And then in the constructor, you identify what that validation is. Once you have that set up, you can just validate whatever type of object of T that you have. So for us today, this is going to be really simple. We just have a type of int, so we're not doing a complex object, although we could. We could put an entire form class object inside of this validation. And I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm going to throw this validation piece inside of the component, but we could have this validation logic outside of our component as well. So the first thing I need to do is pull in a using statement here for Fluent Validation. And I also need using Fluent Validation dot. In order to see if things have validated properly or not, we need to be able to get results. So we need to pull in the results namespace too. And we'll see where that's handy in just a moment. The next thing we need to do is decide what we're validating and create a validator for it. So I'm going to say class count by validation, and it needs to inherit from abstract validator. And we don't have any class objects here to throw in. We'll just say it's an integer. That's what we're validating. So now we've got a count by validation. The next thing we need to do is define what exactly it is we're validating. So we need a constructor here. I'm going to use a shortcut, say ctor, hit tab twice, and it's going to template that out for me. Inside of this constructor, we're going to use this Fluent syntax, hence the name, Fluent Validation, where we just say rule for, and then we define what our rule needs to be to validate this type. So in here, I want to say rule for, and I'm going to, let's see, we can just say since it's not a complex type, we're just going to pass it along like this. It doesn't have any properties. Normally you'd have prop here, whatever that property is, maybe it's person.name, something like that. Since it's just a plain integer, we don't have anything to pass along. So rule for, and then we need to define what the rule on this type is. So we can create multiple rules. Let's just do a simple one. Let's start with something custom. I'm trying to remember if I want to do custom here. See, we can do built-in validation rules, or we can create custom ones. We can say greater than, so we can say it has to be greater than 0. We can use this keyword must, so it must align to some type of validation rule. This is a custom way to define a validation here. Let's go ahead and try that one out. So we can say must, and then we would pass in our object again. Must I is not equal to 0, for example. So if I is not equal to 0, or if it fails validation, we need a message. So we could say with message. This is if it does not pass. So if this validation fails, what do we tell the user? And we can say must not be 0. So this is our very simple validation rule to kind of rule out that the person hasn't entered 0 into our input box. The next thing we need to do is wire up this validation. So there's no default way to handle this. We need to kind of work with our events here in our data binding to kind of trigger what happens when validation occurs and when it occurs. For the most part, though, we have this ability to validate that it's not 0. So let's go back into our input, and on our event here, I'm actually going to take out this binding because I want to handle this a little more with a little more granularity. And I'm going to say on change, we're going to do an event. So we're going to handle this and we'll say on count by changed, and we're going to capture that event here, and we'll say UI arguments. I'm trying to remember exactly. UI event args. UI change event args is the one I want. We're going to pass in the arguments from that change event. And we should get the red squigglies cleared out there. Now we can say on count by changed. We can wire up to this event. And when this count by changed happens, we want to validate what's going on. So we need a validation result, which is something that we don't have set up yet. This validation result is coming from this Fluent Validation.results. You see that this is actually grayed out right now because it's not in use. And the next thing we're going to do is add that result. So we'll say validation result. Let's just call it, I'm just going to call it val for short. And we need to new up a validation result like this. And by default, what I've found out, again, I don't have a ton of experience with the Fluent Validation, but by default, if we just new up an empty instance of this, we'll get a passing or valid state. So we're just going to, by default, just have this valid state, and then we'll change that state depending on what is happening in the UI. So we just need to set up this basic placeholder first, but inside of our onChanged event, what we'll do is say val, and we're going to set this validation result based on what changes have happened in the UI. We also need to new up a count by validation. That's something else we're missing. So we'll set up another field here called validator. We need a count by validation. So we have validator equals new count by validation. So now we have our validator set up, and we can say val equals validator dot validate. And then we can pass in our why no var keyword. I could use var here. I'm just being a little explicit. It's just a matter of taste, I guess. But I should be able to do var here. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't give me any problems with that. I was just being well, no, it does. Because it is a local variable, and it doesn't like it because of the scope. So yeah, we actually need, I guess I caught that by habit. So we actually need to use the fully qualified type there. So now I can say val equals validator, because validate is going to, if we look at the method signature in Visual Studio here, what we're getting back when we call validate is a validation result. So we're going to take this validation result and set that back to our val instance here. So we need to put what we're going to validate inside of this method call. So we're going to have to grab something from UI event changed args, and what comes back from this event changed args is going to be an object. We need to create an integer from it because our validate or validator is of type of int. So we need to do some parsing here. We're going to say new value equals, and I'm going to be explicit here again because I want to make sure that I'm getting back an integer here. And I'm going to say e dot value. And if we do this, we're going to get some red underscores here. And then what we get back from UI event args.value is either going to be a string or a Boolean value. So we need to do a little parsing. I could do try parse here. I'm going to be lazy. I'm just going to do parse. And this should do the trick for us. And I'm still getting a little... Oh, I need to convert it to a string first, because it will not do object directly. So there we go. We're going to get back a string because it's not going to be true or false, because it's going to be coming from a text input. I know it's going to be a string. So I'm going to call value to string, which then gets parsed into an integer. We'll go ahead and validate this new value. So now I have a new value I'm validating. And this will tell me whether or not I have a valid state. Boom, exception. Yeah, so I've left myself open to possible exception here. I could do try parse. Again, I'm just trying to keep it simple. Can it be null at some point? Yeah, it probably... I'm assuming it could be null if... I have to see what gets passed back if there's nothing in the box, if it's an empty string or if it's null. But you know, we're just kind of doing some basics here just to test out some simple validation rules. We could put other guard clauses in here to make sure that we don't have a null value and all those things as well. So we're starting with baby steps, and we'll work our way up to some more complex things as we go. So definitely, I wouldn't leave it in like a production mode. This is more for just hashing out some demos to make sure that the Fluent Validation library actually just even works in this environment. So the next thing we need to do is we'll do a little wrap here and say if val is valid. So if we have a valid state, then we can say that count by equals the new value, like that. So we're going to keep our current value if this doesn't validate properly. We also need to do some type of display to the user to tell them that there's a validation that has failed and to do something about it. Otherwise, it's just not going to make any sense. We're going to change the value, and count by isn't going to do anything. So let's go back here and we'll add some more markup. Underneath this button, I'm going to need to iterate over something here. I'm going to say let's say if the page is not valid, so val that is valid. So if we're not valid, we're going to display something here. Let's put this in an unordered list, or actually let's use an ordered list. So we have an ordered list, and then we'll say for each. And I'm using an ordered list, at least a list of some type here, because the validation rules that we're setting could be multiple failures. So we could have one or more validation errors. We don't want to just display one. We want to make sure we catch them all. So we'll say for each error in validation errors, then we can go through and display a list item of errors. And we can say at error dot message. And that error message is what we get from this validator that we set up when we said rule 4 must not be equal to 0. We're going to fail with the message must not be 0. that's where that message is going to come from. We'll display that there. And the more rules we add here and the more failures we have, the more list items will trickle out in this message box. So feel pretty confident that we're almost there. We also need to add, we're going to have to tell the UI that there's an update that's been made. So we want to say, when this is all said and done, that state has changed. All right, so I think this should complete the idea. Let's go ahead and do a quick run and see what we're going to get. So the first thing I want to do is check and make sure that my text box is still working and that I can increment at all. So make sure the counter still works. So we haven't broken anything here. Count by, let's try 5, and we should get 10. If we do 0, there we go. We got must not be 0. So our validation is working. But there's a little bit more to the story here because we could still click the button and we're still incrementing by that previous value that was set. We might want to do a little more work here to make it a little more user-friendly, maybe prevent this click from happening. Can you check the current page size? Sure, no problem. So let me do, let's do this. Let's pull up our network traffic. I'm assuming you want to see what all is being pulled down. So we'll do a hard reload here. 2.2 megs transferred for a hello world clicky button. This is, like I said, this is the WebAssembly version. This isn't Razor components, so it is going to be rather large. They're working on that linker. Once the linker is more improved, that page size should come down quite a bit. For the scope of what we're working with, that's a pretty large page size. Just got I can't see these screens well. I want to see what we're dealing with here. Oh, Fubaris, thanks for the bits, man. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm gonna be dead honest with you about the size here. It is large, but this is still a beta. It's still a beta offering. This is release 8, I think. We're on version 8.0 right now, or 0.8.0, not even a full 1.0, but this is a 0.8.0 release. So we're going to see improvements come along. That's another reason why the team chose to do Razor components before making Blazor an official release. Razor components comes next year. We can swap over and do this in Razor components in a little bit, and you'll see that it's going to be like, I don't know, less than 100K, I would assume. Maybe less than 200K, just to be safe. Razor components can be much smaller. But for now, this is what we're dealing with. And when we pull in external libraries like Fluent Validation, and I'm not sure how big that package is. I wouldn't assume Fluent Validation is going to be huge by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think you get payload size in here. Yeah, I'm not sure how big that is. I could dig into, let's see if I can find it in here. Let's go into File Explorer. And my point is, anytime you pull in these third-party libraries, you're just going to increase that size even more. Fluent Validation, it's only 286K. So Fluent Validation is a very small part of this. The rest of it seems to be .NET Standard and all that stuff. If we did an empty app, I think we'd see that it's actually just quite big itself. There we go. Now we can actually see in here. So mono, the bootstrapping stuff is fairly large itself. MS Core lib is going to be one of the biggest pieces. So in the meantime, you're using Fable. Fable is really cool. The difference for viewers that don't know what Fable is an F# compiler that compiles F# to JavaScript. So you're able to write F# code, but at the end of the day, it becomes JavaScript code. So there's the key difference there. Not saying that one way is better than another, just a difference, right? You'd get similar development experience using something like TypeScript. They kind of are the same concept, but you're using F#, the functional C#-like language or Microsoft-based language to create that JavaScript instead. But you're still dealing with JavaScript libraries and things like that. I don't know like what the interoperability would be like in Fable. Maybe you can chime in. Like if I have a third-party library I pull out of NuGet, does that get translated into JavaScript automatically? How does that work? Never actually dealt with Fable, but I've heard a little bit about it. It seems pretty cool. So let's see. We can count by. The problem here is when we validate, we're keeping the current value. We're not doing anything to stop this from still being interactive. So let's go back. Great question, by the way, on the page size. Like pointing that stuff out. It is useful, and it's good to be transparent about the state that Blazor is in right now. It's still a work in progress. So you interop with JS libraries for the most part, and the types come from the TypeScript community. Yeah, so it's very, very similar to TypeScript development then. But nevertheless, it is Fable with F# is really cool. A really cool concept. Let's see. So onCountChanged, and we have a page state here. Matter of fact, let's kind of do a little refactor here. I don't like this val thing here. Oops, I mashed a hotkey where I shouldn't have. Thought I had those cleared out. Sorry about that. Let's change this. I meant to do Control-RR. Do a little refactor here. I'm just going to call it page validation, just so we know what we're dealing with. So page validation is valid. We're going to write that stuff out. We still have a button that is clickable, which is not good practice in my opinion. I'm just going to pull these quotes out of here just to make this a little more obvious what we're doing. And I'm going to say disabled in here. And what we can do now that we have a page state or a validation state is we can say disabled equals, we can say @ and we can say page validation dot is valid. And I got to reverse the logic on this because we don't want to disable the button if it's valid. We want to disable it if it is not valid. So now we can set the state of this button to where we can't click it anymore. And we also want to kind of toggle this, right? We don't want to show the button primary class. What we want to do is set up a CSS class that is disabled if we have a disabled button. So we'll put a string here. We'll create a string field that is called button CSS. And we will simply just check if the page is valid. And if it is valid, then we will use this button primary class. If it's not valid, we will use a btn disabled class. let those red squiggles go away. We'll go back up here into our class and replace this with our button CSS. So now we're going to toggle the state of the visual state of the button as well as the disabled state of the button. So if we come back and rerun our page, when we count by 0, we should get a disabled state. So now if we click, we count by 1, we can count by 5, and if we count by 0, as soon as I hit 0 and I navigate off and I create that changed event, we've got a disabled button. I can no longer click this button. So now we're actually working with some decent validation. You can imagine a form of some kind with multiple fields where we have this disabled until all those fields are properly met with the requirements. So now we can't click and we have to change because it must not be 0. Just to show that as soon as I click off of this again, we've re-enabled the button. So now we've got some validation going that's actually meaningful. Let's do a little more with it. So we definitely don't want 0. This would actually include 0, but we could do this as well. We could say rule for, I just want to show off the power of this Fluent Validation library. Again, I just picked this up the other day. I've heard about it before. I've never really used it, but just from tinkering with it for just a few minutes, I found a lot of really cool stuff. So we can say, I think it's range. Yeah, maybe it's between. Yeah, exclusive between. We can say exclusive between defines an exclusive between validator on the rule of the current builder, but only for property types implement IComparable. Validation will fail if the value of the property is outside the specified range. So that's what I want. Exclude between. So if it's outside of a specified range, then it will not be valid. So if it is outside of 1 or 9, then I'll fail with the message that the value must be between 1 and 9. There we go. So that added another rule. Even though they overlap, we have both of those rules. I think, yeah, I'm just thinking out loud here, it's probably handy to have both rules, even if they overlap like this, because this allows you to notify users of what is allowed and what is not allowed inside of an input. So let's go back and revalidate this again. Now we should have a little bit different behavior. We won't be able to do 10 this time. So now I can click. We increment by 1. I can count by 5s, but I should not be able to count by 10. And there we go. Must be between 1 and 9. And just to show what I was talking about earlier, if I put in 0, it says it must not be 0 and it must not be, or it must be between 1 and 9. If you have very complex things that you have to validate, it's nice to let the users know what is allowed, like passwords are a nightmare. Everybody knows this, so it's good to show what your password requirements are, even if you have overlapping rules. So it's nice to have there, and that is why I initially set this up as a for each, so we could show all of those validation failures. So another thing that we would probably want to do is show next to the box here some type of symbol to identify that this is failing validation. Maybe change the color of the input box. We could do that very easily. We can bind a CSS class, just as we did with the button. We could create a class and bind that to the input button as well. So that's something that's easily accomplished with this. For the most part, I like this Fluent Validation setup. It's really easy. I grabbed it off the shelf. It seems to work just fine. I can enable and disable buttons based off of the validation state. It seems to work really well. One thing that we haven't dealt with yet is ABC characters. It seems that it's... let's see what it'll do. This is probably causing an actual runtime error. So input string was not in the correct format. So early on, we all kind of understood that this parse was going to be problematic when the type that came through was not an integer. So we could work around that. We can improve that as well. Another thing that we could look at here, just trying to think off the top of my head, we could actually eliminate, sorry, this is where my thought train was going before it got derailed. We knew this was going to fail. A quick way to handle this in the client side is to go back to this type and not allow text, but change this to number. So that would actually eliminate that issue there. So if we come back and refresh this page again, we shouldn't be able to type anything but numeric characters into this box. So there, the good old HTML5. We can't. I'm mashing the A key and nothing's happening. I can use these tick boxes to increment. And notice as I tick these, the state value, depending on where, so this is really tricky. I've noticed this before. The changed event doesn't fire until your cursor leaves the little uptick. If I zoom in, it may be easier to see. But if my mouse is inside of this, the validator doesn't trigger until my mouse leaves the actual text box. See that there? So when you're clicking through like this, I've got it zoomed in so this button is huge. But when the buttons are small, sometimes just the UI will accidentally bump you off of the radio button and you'll get that changed event. So it kind of looks like it may not be working if you're clicking really fast. You're like, oh, it never triggered. You just kind of got to slide your mouse over a little bit. Just kind of one of the oddities I've noticed with the way the events are handled. All right, so we've got that working for us. Again, this abstract validator of T, we could create like a page model, and we could have things like a big form with names and dates and phone numbers and whatnot, and we could just pump that model in to this abstract validator and just add rules based on properties over and over again to create our validator. What's nice about this type of a system here is I can take this count by validation and I can use this validation. Assume for a minute that this is on a piece of code that does, say, a person object or something more robust. We want to enter this into a database. We would want to revalidate this on the server because we can never, ever trust the client. Even with WebAssembly, we shouldn't trust what the client inputs and sends to the server. So what we'd want to do is come up to validation.shared, and we can come into this and say add new class. And inside of this shared library, I'm going to say count by validation. I'm going to add that. I'm going to make this a public class here in a sec. Let's go back and grab our validation code out of our component and move that to a shared place. Make this public. It's not inside of our component anymore. We also need to pull in that library. Let's go to our solution and say manage NuGet packages, and we will add that to our shared folder as well, our shared project. That is installing, and we should be able to just control period now and pull in those namespaces. So Fluent Validation comes in. We don't need these guys. So here's our validator now, and our validator is in our project shared our shared project in our solution. And now in pages, I can come in, and instead of this count by validation coming from here, let's see, we need to add a using statement up here. This is using count state has changed validation dot shared, and that should give us our client validation. So we move that logic outside of the component now and into a shared place. So if I was on a say I was on my server and I had data that I was entering into a database, I could come in and add that as well. I would need my Fluent. Let's see, I don't know if I actually need that here. So yeah, I would still need my Fluent validation in here. So I need to come back to my solution level and say configuration, manage NuGet packages. I want to add that Fluent validation everywhere because I'm going to use it on my server. So we'll just check all the boxes here, hit install, manage that from one place. So on my controller, if I had an action that was taking in those inputs, I could validate here as well. So if I had an HTTP GET action or a POST action, I could come in and say the same logic. I would use the same thing here. I would set up a count by validation, and I would get the results and check before I do any database work. So I would have a function on my controller side. We could kind of dummy one of these out, and we would have something like this that would be HTTP post. The action name doesn't really matter. I'm not going to wire it all up. I just want to kind of show the idea here. We could say public, and it would take, it would return, who knows, just some type of status. Let's just say string for now. We'd return a HTTP status code. I'm not going to go through all the motions, but we'd say set some value here. And inside of this post action, we would have, say, an integer would come in. So we would validate, and then we would write to the database, maybe with Entity Framework or something. That validation code would be identical across the board here. So we already have the validator. We just need to new up an instance of these two things and then do our checking in here. So we'd have our count by validator, bring in a using statement here. Oh, just trying data annotations in there. Fluent validation results. So we'd go through it there. So Fubaris, looks like there's an on input event too that would do the same trick. Okay, cool. We can actually try that out. I'd like to see how that works. I know there's multiple ways. There's a lot with key up and down too that I always forget that there's better options for those. So this would be something similar. Not all code paths return a value. Yeah. This is by no means any type of best practice. I'm just trying to get this to show what an action would look like. So you would do your validation, and inside here you would say if, except you probably wouldn't call it page validation, but I think everybody's following along what I'm talking about. If this is valid, then you would do your database rights here. So the same validator, point is the same validator can be used on the back end as well as the front end. And we're not doing any JavaScript here, so it's the same code that's coming from our shared project that we can use anywhere in our solution. Even if we had a, say, a Xamarin app that went with this whole setup here. We have our web app running in WebAssembly, but we have a companion app on mobile that's using Xamarin. We can still use the same validation across Xamarin as well. So how cool is that? That we can just make our code that portable that we could have a validation library that's shared across any .NET application type. And again, there's additional helpers for Xamarin that we could also try to integrate and make that even easier. But the base validation itself is portable across pretty much any project type. Any project type that's a .NET standard app. That's the benefit of being able to run this without JavaScript. I have tested this out in Blazor components. It does work the same. Let's take a jump over. Let's do one more thing here real quick, and then we'll take a jump back over to Blazor components and take a look at the page size in there, just to kind of do a comparison. Since Fubaris one here in the chat room's interested in that, I'd like to kind of explore that as well. So let's try this other event that was mentioned here. We have on change. There's also on input. So on input. On input sets the on input attribute. Get value. Should be UI changed event args. So same event arguments come across. Not sure what comes through on that. Let's take a look and see. Let's see when it's changed and how it acts. So cool suggestion. Let's see. I'll zoom in again as well because that seemed to help. Because when you click these, depending on what's happening up here, it sometimes like flicks the cursor around. So let's zoom way in. Not that far in. So we can click down. Yeah, it immediately validates, except I'm getting it on 1. That may be a logic error on my part. So did I not notice that before? I was probably clicking through these too fast. Yeah, that actually uncovered an error on my part. Fubaris. Or Fubarius, sorry. There's actually a logic error in here that I didn't see in my validator. To be 1 to 9, actually, this should have been 0 to 10. So this is not including, it's exclusive. So we want everything between those numbers. So we want it to be equal to, just for clarification here, we should probably change that. It needs to be between those two numbers and may not be any of those numbers. So that works immediately. I like that. So cool suggestion. I like the input on input trigger a little better there. In that scenario, I like that. I think on change is the default if we were using the bind attribute here. If we just said bind, I've noticed an issue where if you're using bind seems to take precedence over what's happening within the event, so the validation doesn't trigger. So that's why I didn't use bind in here and bind this count by value. It just seems to not work. So let's go back. I'll keep this application open. Remember, this was 2.2 megs roughly. Let's go over to Razor components. It's obviously going to be smaller, but I'm just curious as to how much smaller. So let's go to this web application 1 is probably what I named it, because I was just kind of hacking around. It's the same idea though, just with Razor components instead. I like to kind of hash things out in Razor components because I have the ability to do debugging in Razor components if something goes wrong. Then we can always try it out in WebAssembly next. So running the same app, and let's do let's pull up the network traffic here. Just to be on the safe side, we'll do empty cache, hard reload. Alrighty, so 99K transferred. So yeah, that's a lot smaller. Again, we're not pushing any libs across, right? We're not pushing any libraries across. No .NET libraries are coming across the wire. You can even see 11 requests here, which is also smaller versus, do I still have that window open? I do not. Let's go back to this guy. I'm going to control F5 here. I don't even bother pressing debugging because it just slows things down. You can't debug anyway. So just a little side-by-side comparison. And this is expected. This isn't anything that's not, I guess, public knowledge, I guess is a way to say it. I'm not unearthing any new secrets here. It's just if you're newer to this concept of Razor components and Blazor, this might be new for you. Which again, it's a new framework, so that's not it's not anything to be surprised about either. 27 requests, so less than half the requests and just a fraction of the page size. Because WebSockets is really cool. It's really enabled some neat stuff. What's interesting here is the load time was actually higher on the side for some reason. Not quite sure what that was all about. That actually should have been a lot faster. I know I blew out the cache, but it seems like it should have taken longer to load the WebAssembly version of this. It's coming up pretty quick though. So that's interesting. A little bit of latency for something. Must be the WebSocket spinning up or something. You can't really see the WebSocket activity here either. So this is the WebSocket itself. Let's see. I don't know if we can see anything. I'm not really versed in WebSocket debugging on Chrome, so I don't know if we can actually see anything inside of this view here. What we can do is we can go into Telerik Fiddler, and we can actually see traffic coming across. Oh, there it goes. There's the traffic. It was hiding for some reason. So there's our binary traffic coming through. We can see this really easily in Fiddler as well. So we can see the length of those requests. and how long they're taking to get back and forth. They're really small though. Of course, we're only doing button clicks and updating these panels here. I'm not sure if we start building out a full-scale app, how large these will be, but it seems to be pretty efficient. So that's all I have for validation right now. We could create some more complex behaviors in here. I think I might save that for another show. I want to integrate this with another project that I have going. I don't want to start on that today. It is 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is a Friday. How many of you guys are willing to stick around for checking out that project I mentioned at the top of the show? This was the project by, hang on, let me pull it up here. I mentioned this guy here. Blazor toast notifications using only C# and HTML. How many folks are willing to stick around for probably another half hour to check this out? It's going to be a little bit of copy paste. I'll just take the bits that's here and we can talk through them as I kind of work those into a project. Does anybody want to see that? If you want to stick around, we'll check that out. Come on, chat room, don't be shy. Do you want to build a toast notification real quick? This is basically what it'll look like. This guy here. All right, we got at least one standing around. Fubarius, you're my buddy today. Thanks for being interactive. We got a lot of shy folks in the chat room. So let's teach them a lesson. They're going to stick around, hopefully, whether they like it or not. So let's check this out. This is by Chris Santi. I don't know why I want to say Sanity. It's baked into my head or something. But Chris Santi is got this really great blog post, part of the second annual C# Advent Calendar, which is also awesome. I'm going to click on this just real quick. If you look up this article in the show notes for today, click through on that link I just clicked. So under the literal toast picture, this says it's a post part of the second annual C# Advent. The C# Advent is literally 50 articles about .NET that were released in the month of December. I have an article up there about Razor components. If you want to learn more about Razor components and the architecture of it, I have a fairly in-depth article there. There are lots of awesome .NET articles in here, so make sure you click through to this link and do a lot of reading. Now let's get into this project. So I'm going to go back and open my Visual Studio up again. And we'll go just right into building this out. Let me see, just for the purpose of making this go a little bit quicker, I'm going to choose Razor components. And also, again, as I mentioned, I'd like to have debugging. I'd like to be able to play around with debugging in case something goes wrong. This is not code that I wrote, so there's a possibility that I will copy paste something out of it that I fat finger, because I do that a lot. So let's do server side in ASP.NET Core, which is Razor components. That'll give us our debugging. It's a little bit faster for development experience as far as I've noticed. And we'll build this guy out. So where do we start? I want to grab this naming it Chris. Where does Chris start? Chris has, he starts with the enum. First thing he's doing, he's setting up, and these are bootstrap classes here. These are basic, info, success warning. These are your colors and different types of toast notifications that he's setting up. So he's putting all of this under a services folder. So let's go into our application. There's already a services folder in this demo. So let's just add to that, and we'll say class. And what is he calling it? Toast level. So you'd think as a gamer my aim would be a little better. I keep clicking on random stuff in my taskbar. So toast level, and we can drop this class out. It's going to be an enum public class toast, or enum toast level. So we've got our toast levels. The next thing we're setting up is a class called toast service. This is the part that I really wanted to check out for my own. He's actually using a service to talk to the toast notification component. I think this is a really nice setup here. So I wanted to see exactly how he did this. So inside of the service, we'll add another class. And this is called toast service. And we'll paste over the top of that. Let's look at what we have in here. I think we may need to pull in, we need to pull in some other using statements in here. So he's got a timer, which I'll point out, this is also very handy, that you can use .NET timers. There's a couple of different ones. I'm not sure which one he's using. So let's see if we can spot that somewhere in his text. So it's calling a toast service with the following code. So I don't see what type of timer he's using. So there in .NET there is a system.threading timer. There's also system.timers. Let's see if this just jives. So one way we can tell is the APIs are slightly different. The countdown, the way he's got it enabled start stop here, is not a threading timer. So the APIs are different. Go back and control period here. This is going to be a system.timer. So system.timers timer. Now you can see that those have the red squiggles have gone away. So that's one way to tell which type of timer is being used. We also don't need all this junk. I'm going to do remove in sort using statements. That'll clear those guys out. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. So we've got some delegates up here. We've got a event called action and an event called on hide. Event called on show, an event called on hide. On show, we take a string and return a toast level. We take a string and a toast level. I was thinking func instead of action. So we're taking in two inputs here, and then on hide, we're not taking anything, we're just hiding something and not returning or not taking any parameters. We have a countdown timer because I'm assuming this toast notification will fade on its own if we have that countdown set. Let's see, show toast. So when we show a toast, if there is if this is not null, so if onShow is not null, then we'll invoke that method, passing in the message in level. So this is show toast is something that we can invoke. Start countdown. So this is going to start the countdown for showing or hiding that toast notification. That was my assumption of what he was going to do here, and it seems to be right. So when we set the countdown, we're setting up a new timer, and then when the time has elapsed, it's going to trigger hide toast. So as I said, this is going to automatically hide the toast after a while. which seems to be a pretty common behavior with toast notifications. Hide toast. It's a method that we can call that will invoke our onHide method, and then dispose is just going to make sure that our timer, if there is one, gets collected by garbage collection. So that's pretty self-explanatory, I think. There's nothing in here that really surprises me, but I think it's well laid out, and I think this is a good idea of how to implement something like this. So let's go check out the next piece. So building the toast notification component. Trying to just kind of read through what he's saying here. He's talking about putting it in separate files. This is going to use the Razor Pages semantics. Feels odd. One service per notification. Yeah. I think it may depend on how the service is being resolved. So let's see how he resolves the service. Didn't quite get to that yet. Registering with dependency injection. He's using add scoped. So it is going to be a singleton. He's using scoped because if you're using Razor components and you use singleton, it's very literal in the sense that you get one instance per application. That means even if multiple people are attached to that application, all of them get that instance. Scoped, on the other hand, will be per user. But it's still the same instance per user, it looks like. So yeah, I do see where you're coming from there. We'll have to see how this pans out. I think I might need to read his article that he's also linked here, Service Lifetimes, to see how all of those things pan out behind the scenes. So scroll back up. We'll revisit that as we go. And we've got the service built. He's using this toast.cshtml.cs. This prefix or this suffix here is using the Razor Pages type of suffix. So he's separating his logic out into different pieces between the markup and the code. So Fubari is he said the keyboard event. The event keyword is what to do. Okay. So each time an event's triggered, the keyword is what's differentiating the different components. And yeah, it's using plus equals. Okay, good. Good to point out. So yeah. So this will allow you to not accidentally override individual toast notifications by setting like one single value to the event. Let's see here. So let's grab this logic out. We'll walk through that in the code here. I think he put it in a project. I'm just going to drop it in shared. We could have a component project, and I'm not going to go through all that just for one demo, but it is something that can be done. You could put it in a shareable project. Let's see, just to be sure what he named this is toast. Duh. All right. Toast.cs. All right, so we've got the code for the toast notification here. Whenever you do this code behind version of a Blazor component, you have to inherit from Blazor component. So I need to bring in that namespace here. Toast service. We'll bring in that namespace as well. And then I'm not sure what this is. What's going on here? Background CSS class. Is there something? Oh, is there a missing quote in this? Is that what that is? It didn't copy paste right out, or there's a error in. It looks like there may be a copy paste error in here. Yeah, I think that may have been a paste fail on the content management side of things. So it looks like it may be a typo in the article itself. This should be some type of selector. I'm not quite sure what. Let's see if he has source code. How about that? Let's scroll to the bottom. Maybe he's got a GitHub repo sample or something. Code for this can be found on GitHub. There we go. That's what I say. Fail together so we can figure this stuff out. Pages shared. Toast. Oh, he did keep it in one project. I thought this was in a separate project. Whoops. That's the markup side. Here's the code side. Yeah, I'm assuming it's something very simple. Oh, $. The $sign through the content management system input for a loop, it looks like. I'm just going to grab this whole method from lines 36 on to 63 and pull those in that way. Boom. That fixed it up. Kind of curious as to what the $sign is even being used for here. Why use the $sign at all? Kind of curious. Nothing really rings a bell. Like, this is usually for string interpolation, and I don't see any interpolation being done. Yeah, possibly. Chris was in here a little while ago. He must have bailed on the chat as soon as I kind of glossed over the project at the beginning. I wish he would have stuck around. It's either muscle memory or maybe he had a different. He maybe refactored this from something, and yeah, like not using var. He may have refactored off of something else that was originally using, like maybe he had a background class that was doing a lot of fancy stuff with string interpolation that decided to do a switch statement instead, and they just broke it all up and forgot to remove that. I don't see any other use for it, and in fact, the last iteration of it is missing it. So we'll have to check that out at the end too. Maybe we can do a pull request back or something. I don't know. Let's see here. All right. I've got that bit of code in there. I didn't really walk through what it does. So we've got some properties in here. We've got the heading message, is it visible, the CSS class, and the icon class. On a init, we're setting up those event handlers. We have show toast in here. So let's see, build toast settings. That's another method down below that gives us our, I guess this sets up our settings. So this gives us build toast settings. We pass it the level, and it gives us back our background color, our icon, and our heading. So that's what that does. Okay. So we've got a little bit of imperative programming here where we're just kind of setting state for all of the stuff that goes into this toast notification. And then we're going to build that, which basically sets a bunch of settings. We're going to set is visible to true, and then we'll notify the UI that there's a UI update. Next thing is it does the dispose here again. It's taking that event handler out of the stack. It's pretty basic stuff here. I like the fact that he's got the injection going this way, and using it's a nice use of the inject parameter there, or what do you call that attribute? So it's taking in as a property through dependency injection. So it's property dependency injection, the toast notification service. So that's how that gets set up. And that is the code for it. Now we need the markup. So in shared, I'm going to do add new item, web, Razor page. That might give me everything. I don't know if I need that. I'll just do Razor view, and then I'll rename it appropriately. Did I close the article by accident or not? I think I did. When I was looking through GitHub, I accidentally closed that article out. There it is again. All right. So here's the markup. So we'll call this one toast.cshtml. Add that. And this will be our markup for the component. So this is how the code behind and the code get connected together. We've got our toast base and our toast CSHTML. Toast base is actually this guy here. So public class toast base. This is how those two pieces get linked together. And I need to rename this. So this needs to be CSHTML.cs. The only reason we do that is so we get this nice nesting feature. So now our markup and our code are in the same tree structure. And so that'll take care of that. But this toast base gets implemented on the front, or the markup side, by using this toast base, inheriting from toast base. And then we can just create the markup, and it says class toast, and then if it's visible, then toast visible is the CSS class, or null. Null might not be my choice here as well. I would probably do string.empty here, but we'll keep his code as is as we work through it. I don't want to introduce any bugs or anything. Background CSS class gets appended to that. So there's two classes being built up here. Then the toast icon gets placed here. So it's using font awesome icons. So the CSS class gets added there. The heading property and the message property are used here. So pretty basic stuff in there as well. Next, we need to actually put some CSS behind this, is what I'm assuming, yep, is going to be the next part. So let's take our CSS. He's using keyframe animations too. That's also a nice, more modern approach to CSS. I like that. Let's go into site CSS. We're going to do the worst thing ever. Scroll down to the bottom and paste our CSS code here. Again, this is demo time. I don't ever suggest just running down to the bottom of CSS file ever and pasting code in. If you're doing any kind of production work, that's a very bad practice. But This is not for best practices today. So toast. This is all of the stuff that goes into displaying that toast notification. Looks like it's using Flexbox. It's got some color attributes and things. And then I like this keyframe animation. It's got a keyframe called fade in. And it's basically just changing the opacity. And if we double click here, let's see if it highlights. No, Visual Studio is not highlighting it for us. I guess it's, yeah, here it is, animation fade in. That's where that keyframe animation actually gets called, is when toast visible is displayed. This animation gets kicked off and it does this opacity change. So that's where the animation itself is being used. Cool. All right. So we'll save that. We can close it out. We need to add this into our project next, or our top level. We need to configure the service. So we need to add a scoped service. This is going to be in our startup. And the weather forecast was a singleton. That one, it doesn't care per user what that instance is. This one does. So I think if I describe this correctly, no matter which, on Razor components, since we're hosting it on SignalR, if you use add singleton, no matter what user hits the application, they will get the same instance of weather forecast service. If you use add scoped, then each user will get their individual instance of toast service. So that seems to be the difference between these two items. Add singleton is application scope, and add scoped is user scope. So per user, we wouldn't want to set off, there may be an instance where you do want to set off application-wide toast notifications. That may be something else to look at, but in this case, we want to be per user. So that's what we're going to add here. Adding toast notification to the main layout. This is the spot you would want to have this in. You don't want to have a bunch of toast notifications inside of your pages, because if I added it, say, on the counter page, then it probably isn't going to display in the right location. So we want to have that at the topmost level of our project. So in our main layout, at the very top here, we're going to add our toast. And it's this may be a Razor issue. I'm getting some bad IntelliSense here, and I don't think it's because it's being typed incorrectly, or because there is an actual error of any kind. I've just seen this kind of pop up where you get some really weird highlighting if you're right under the inherits section here. For example, if I did div here, I'm getting the same thing. Just kind of seen this odd behavior before. See that? It went away. So it's just kind of a Razor bug. If you ever see that happen, it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's just the way it's trying to parse this out. It just kind of misses it for some reason. But notice it went away after I did that. Another thing that would make that go away is if you close this after you've added it and then come back, that problem will be gone. So I see that from time to time. Don't get spooked out by it. Just keep on trucking. Save your page, close it, come back, see if the error's still there. Don't waste a day like trying to figure out why it's not highlighting correctly. Let's do the next step. So we've added the toast notification. We need to bring in font awesome. So this is a third-party font library. Open Iconic. There's actually one built in. I don't know if he needed fonts that aren't in Open Iconic, but that's the one that's by default supplied with Blazor. So he's using something outside of this Open Iconic. And that would go in our index HTML page. We'll add that reference there. So that brings in our style sheet for that font that's being used. I wonder what the font is that he's actually utilizing. It would be in this here, I'd imagine, or maybe in the markup. So FA, I saw it in here earlier. I'm just kind of curious what that font is that we're using a third-party library for. There we go. On icon class, that icon class is built here, times exclamation and check and info. So there's a couple icons that are being pulled in through Font Awesome. So we're almost done here. We've got through that, and we've linked up our resources. We need to use this using statement in view imports. I seem to not have a problem with it, but it looks like he says we need to add this in view imports. Oh, the service needs to be added. Yeah, we probably hit a runtime error with the service, just to make sure when it's doing that property injection, I'm assuming. Sorry I didn't read this ahead of time. I'm not in grave detail anyway. It looks like in order to have this property injection work, that we need to have the view imports here, which needs to be named to my namespace, toast demo, for that to resolve correctly. Possibly that's what's happening there. This doesn't exist. Why? Not sure that's necessary. We'll see. So that was part of one of the steps. We'll have to see if that's something that we need. And then we need to show off. So these are buttons that are going to kick off toast notifications. So we're good to go. If we go to index, paste this in, we should be able to make this work. So let's give this a run. Toast service. This is where that service is needed. Toast service is not in here correctly. Oh, hey, Chris, you're still there. All right. So so you liked the fonts over what was available. That's cool. I was just curious. I don't know much about Open Iconic. I keep clicking that icon or that thing down there. I don't know much about Open Iconic. I don't use it for anything, so I'm a little bit more familiar with Font Awesome and Kendo UI's fonts, but I wasn't sure. I guess my question was, is Open Iconic limited or those fonts didn't exist? Because I'm kind of curious what is available in Open Iconic, because I don't know it well. So good to know. Fonts are just better. Looks like I've hit an error on the last bit here. I'm missing, oh yeah, my injection thing here. Inject services. Thanks for joining us again, Chris. I don't know how long you've been able to listen in we're digging through this. We're almost done. Pretty cool stuff so far. Let's see. I think we're ready to run. Let's see if I've broke anything. Chris, if you didn't hear earlier, we were kind of curious. Under one of the pieces of code, it actually is I think a typo on the blog post itself. So I'm going to go back to the blog post here. I'll zoom in a little bit. I think this is a classic content management issue. On the CSS code, there is kind of gibberish here under the class. But being the seasoned blogger that you are, you added source code for us to go actually look at, which is great. Love that. Clicked on GitHub source code, and there is the actual code for this in this shared folder here. So I'll drill into that real quick. Oops, wrong one. So in the source code, we noticed that that seemed to be a content management issue. So that gibberish was coming from this ampersand, or sorry, the dollar sign, not ampersand. We're curious as to why the dollar sign is there. So we had some assumptions. Maybe it was a refactoring piece that got left over. But is the dollar sign performing any real useful function there, or is it just kind of a typo left over from another implementation you refactored from? So if you're still around, let us know. We're kind of curious. Let's see. Let's kick off a toast notification. Nice fade in with that animation, and it automatically pops out of existence. So awesome. So these have their own, I noticed they have their own event handlers. We don't have a dismissal thing on here, but that's something that could be added. This is really cool. I like it. I'll try refreshing the page here for a sec. So the positioning, I didn't get into this really either. I'm kind of curious where the positioning is coming from. Like how is it determined that is where the toast notification gets drawn? Okay, so it does look like a typo. That's fine. That's what we assumed. The main concern I had was, were you using that for something that I'm just not aware of? You know, some people have some really nifty tricks up their sleeve sometime, and I didn't know if this was doing some new .NET thing I haven't seen yet, or if it was just a typo. So the positioning works on CSS. Let's see. Let's take a look at it real quick. Let's go back to the CSS code. I noticed it was using Flexbox, but I didn't really dig in too far. So display text. It's got the border radius. So you could just tweak the CSS and have it, whoops, that's not it. You could just tweak the CSS and you could have it display at the top of the page, bottom of the page, all that type of stuff. That's pretty cool. Yeah, right. That would be my cover story. It's like, oh, you don't know about the random dollar sign operator yet? Well, anyhow, we found a great blog post, by the way. I'm glad that we were able to cover it in detail with some extra time. And I'm glad you joined the show so we could point out the problem on the rendering side, so you can fix that. I write blog posts all the time, so I run into these same issues all the time, and it's kind of, you know, content managers, whether using Jekyll or a big, you know, enterprise level one, you always get these little hiccups, and authors tend to not see them because we're trying to get all these blog posts pushed out. So usually the first run of comments on our articles is there's a typo, there's something not showing up right. So we managed to get one of those out of the way. So there's we've re-implemented it and it works great. I love that the demo shows people how easy this type of stuff is to do in Blazor. And for the most part, it's really low code. Blazor's pretty simple in the way it operates. There's a lot of learning curve behind a lot of frameworks in the JavaScript world. And so far, Blazor's been able to tame that pretty well. We'll have to see as Blazor grows, like how the learning curve holds up. But so far the learning curve seems to be pretty much under control. And I think this kind of proves the point. Like, this was something that you were able to outline in a single blog post and in very finite detail of each step on how to build it. And the blog post itself still is relatively short, or it's something that you can read in just a few minutes rather than I won't name any specific JavaScript frameworks, but doing something like this may be like a workshop. I don't know. Like, it seems like the learning curve on those things is pretty horrendous. Having experience with a lot of those things, it's not the first 7 steps aren't setting up Webpack and dealing with npm modules and running 7 command line operations before we can even get started. So it's a breath of fresh air. It's a great blog post, so I was glad I was able to share it. Everything that I talked about on the show today, I will post on my website at edcharbonneau.com. So I'll post some show notes up here in a little bit. It'll take me a little while to compile the few things that I talked about in the show. We'll have Chris's blog post in there. I'll post that in the chat room as well, again, in case people that are here now that want to wait for that post to come out. Let me see if I can actually get my chat going again. Twitch is giving me issues today, so my chat room, if I haven't been too interactive with typing things into the chat room, it's because it's just not working for me. So there's Chris's blog post. Make sure you check that out. He's got source code up on GitHub at the very end. If you don't want to walk through all the steps again manually like I just did on the show, you can grab those bits right from his GitHub page. So those are available there. The rest of what we talked about, I will post up on my show notes here on, so let's see, the toaster, let's see, that link didn't come up for me, but let's do a search. Oh, okay, yeah, that one uses Toaster.js, or it uses the CSS from Toaster.js. I have seen it. I don't think I've, if I did talk about it, it was early in, maybe a couple months ago. Looks like a pretty similar implementation too. I'm wondering, is he using an interop on his? Let's see. Extensions, properties, content. Yeah, no CSS in this one as well, or JavaScript in this one as well. Sample project. Oh wow, there's a lot of different examples here. I'll have to dig into that one sometime and check it out. I know I mentioned it a long time ago. If I didn't mention it here, it was on Twitter or something like that. But there's another way to do it. This one has a lot of settings. So there's progress bars and all types of things to toggle along with it. So it'd be interesting to compare the two ideas and see how similar they are in implementation. So cool stuff. Thanks for sharing that. Lalo? Trying to read these names. But thanks for the share. So I'll post those. I'll try to include that as well for comparison purposes. I don't know if there was a blog post to go along with that Toaster JS clone, but Chris has a nice article there to kind of walk you through each step in that process of building that out, which is nice. Yeah, it was all C#. I just popped open the source code, and the components folder didn't have any JavaScript in it. It was just CSS. So it looks like they were able to strip out all the JavaScript from that. I've seen over the last couple months that people start with JS interops, and they slowly have been able to weed out all the JavaScript from these clones or ports of things and put them into pure C# projects. I know that's something that we're looking heavily into at Telerik. If you are new to the show or you don't know who I am, I work for Telerik. So full disclosure, the component vendor that makes all the awesome UI components. I'm fortunate enough to work on that team, and it's something that we're heavily investigating. Like, what do people want from UI components for Blazor? How much JavaScript are we willing to tolerate? And one of the things that we have found out is if you're writing a lot of JavaScript interops, the JavaScript, I don't want to say the syntax, but the style that JavaScript kind of imparts, that style kind of leaks back. It's a leaky abstraction that kind of finds its way back into the way your APIs are written in C#, and it's somewhat obvious when it happens. So kind of an example of that would be, if I look at the toast notification here, we're using events like this, right? We have on show, and we're doing plus equals, and we're wiring up our event through an action, kind of in this manner. When you get into the JavaScript interop stuff, some of this doesn't really translate well, and you end up getting the JavaScript style of implementing these things leaking back into your C# APIs. So we're looking at that very heavily to figure out what's the tolerable level, how much JavaScript do we really want, and it looks like the least amount of JavaScript possible is what people are looking for. So if you have any different opinions on that, either way, more or less JavaScript, just let us know. Like, ping me on the chat room here or on Twitter. So far, like having things like jQuery and stuff is definitely not the favorable approach to building a Blazor component. People don't seem to want any kind of third-party JavaScript behind the scenes. There's going to be some things that do require interop just because there is no support. Thank you for the new follower. Let's see. So Tony the Cobble King, thank you for following, buddy. Glad to have you join the show. We're just getting ready to wrap up. I don't know when you tuned in, but just getting ready to wrap up here. Just kind of talking about web components, since we've got this really cool toast notification example that Chris blogged about. It's just kind of going through the fact that there's no JavaScript behind it, and for the folks that I've talked to so far, they don't want any JavaScript in this if possible. And not just this specifically, but any UI components. the component, the JavaScript seems to leak back into the C# code. It makes it a little messy. There's some things in the DOM that we just can't do with C# yet. So there will be some JavaScript in some components. For example, I showed a file upload about a month ago on here that you cannot do with pure C#, and it required some JavaScript. But I think what people are shying away from isn't so much that if it has a little bit of JavaScript to communicate with the DOM on a missing piece of the puzzle, but what they don't want is like jumping back into like jQuery or some other third-party library being managed behind the scenes, like _JS and things like that being pulled in to make components work. It seems like people are shying away from that so far. So that seems to be like what our research has been right now. And hopefully we'll have something to share with the community pretty soon about what what our research is showing and what people want. So thanks for joining me this week. I will be back next week. I don't know what we're going to talk about yet. I tend to come up with these things very shortly before the show starts. I do take suggestions. I have a repo up on GitHub. I will link that in the show note as I do every time. Let's see. This browser is in development mode. Let's try another one. Let's go to github.com. I've got a GitHub repo for the show if you have feedback. And I'm not logged into this either. Shoot. I will put it in the show notes. It will be linked. Let's see, here we go. Just pull up some old show notes. Where did I put this? I will get notifications for this. I don't physically check it. I wait for notifications to come through. So Blazor StateHasChanged show. If you have any suggestions on topics that you'd like to see, you can post those in here. Just post an issue. I have one going. People seem to want to post this on Twitter rather than in here, but still trying to figure out on the time length of the show. An hour to 2 hours seems to be what most people want. So feel free to chime in on that issue or any others. If you see any projects out there that look really cool that you want to talk about a little bit on the show, we can do that. Feel free to mention things there, or Twitter as well. Again, everything will be up on my GitHub page or my website after the show airs at edcharbonneau.com. I'll see you guys next Friday around the same time. So thanks for joining me. Have a great weekend. Keep on hacking at community stuff so we have stuff to talk about. It's been a lot of fun. Fubarius, thanks a lot for the interaction today, man. A lot of great questions, and it was really cool to be able to answer those, and hopefully I was able to answer them well enough that you got some good information out of it. So take care, everybody, and we'll talk again soon.